Is even a 4090 safe in Unreal Engine 5? Today we're going to be looking at a bunch of Unreal Engine 5 games at ultra settings as well as turning down to high settings, upscaling. We're looking at 1440p, 4K, 1080p, frame generation when it's available, all of the good stuff on the three most powerful GPUs on the market, the 7900 XTX, the 4080, and the 4090. And you'll notice even the 4090 can't always average 60 FPS at 4K Ultra in Unreal Engine 5 games. Why are we focusing on Unreal Engine 5? Because tons of games are going to be using it, and I'm interested in how these GPUs are going to perform in this engine. Detailed look at all of the settings and all of that. Now, the GPUs in this video are the absolute strongest ones available, and if you're interested in the highest end performing gaming hardware, you should also take a quick look at this message from my sponsor. Huge thank you to today's sponsor, Red Magic, for sending me the Red Magic 9 Pro. I'm so happy I can finally tell people about this thing. So I have been using this as my daily driver for the last month, and I used the previous version, the Red Magic 8, for the last year. I loved it. This has everything I loved about that and more. One of the coolest things is you flip a little switch, you go into their customized gaming mode, and when you launch games here, now you get these shoulder triggers, which are customizable game by game. And this gives such a competitive edge, and also it just feels better to play the games. I honestly used to hate playing something like COD Mobile first-person shooters on a phone because, you know, my thumb's gonna move, I'm gonna aim, and now I have to lift up to hit the buttons, and it just feels awkward. But with these customizable shoulder triggers, competitive edge, I can set those to hit anywhere on the screen simply and easily, and now I can aim down sights and shoot with my index fingers just like I would on a controller. Thumbs still take care of aiming and movement. It's super awesome. My students get very curious and jealous when they see me gaming on my lunch break and see what I've got going there. But additionally, so many good features like the massive battery life. This thing can go for days. My wife wants a new phone now. She's so jealous. When you do charge, it's got an 80-watt fast charger, charges up in about 30 minutes. It's crazy. It's got a cooling fan with RGB. It's got little upgrades over the last generation that I like completely flat back on the camera bumps now, and the back cameras are very good quality, as well as this phone still has a headphone jack, guys. So many phones don't have that, and when you're playing a game on a phone, Bluetooth headphones have latency, and it can actually be a competitive edge. You get shot before you hear the gunshot. You know, if you have Bluetooth, if you plug in directly with wired headphones, you don't have that Bluetooth audio latency. Anyway, this thing's awesome. Take a look, follow the link in the video description and pinned comment. Now, we're going to see a ton of cool tests in this video, but we should also think about what these GPUs cost if you think about how they stack up relative to each other. Because you can look at this video as how are GPUs doing in Unreal Engine 5, but you can also look at it as which, you know, a comparison between the GPUs for sure. And so it's important to acknowledge the pricing differences, especially in the current market. If I hopped over to PC Part Picker right now, they're not sponsoring this video, but they survey a lot of major retailers: Amazon, Newegg, Walmart, B&H Photo, a bunch of other random stuff. The point is, you can get a good idea of what things cost currently. 4090s are currently about $2,000. There's one available for a little under $1,900. What a deal. What happened to that? A bunch of 4090s seem to have been shipped over to China to beat the AI GPU ban, causing 4090 pricing to shoot way up right now. Hopefully that ends up coming back down here soon. And that hasn't done any favors to the pricing of the 4080. Which is currently lowest price $1,150. The 7900 XTX, let's go ahead and take a look at that. That's a 2060 popping up for some reason. So that's not a 7900 XTX. The cheapest 7900 XTX we seem to be seeing available right now is $960. So when you're comparing these and thinking about performance and price, definitely think about the fact that the 7900 XTX is $960. You're paying about $200 more to get the 4080, and then you're literally doubling the price to get the 4090. And keep that in mind when you're looking at the performance percentage differences. We've got DLSS, we've got FSR, we've got frame generation, we've got a bunch of Unreal Engine 5 games. Let's hop into the benchmarks and give you some final thoughts at the end. We'll start our testing in what has been the most demanding of the Unreal Engine 5 games I've been looking at, which is Lords of the Fallen. Here at 4K Ultra, you'll see that even the RTX 4090 falls short of a 60 FPS experience here, offering 53 frames per second. The 4080 coming in at 40 FPS and the 7900 XTX at 37. That gives the 4080 an 8% lead over the 7900 XTX, and the 4090 is taking a 43% lead over the 7900 XTX here. And the 1% lows are 32, 34, and 42. So the 4080 has a 6% lead over the 7900 XTX, and the 4090 has a 31% lead over the 7900 XTX. Now, not all games will perform identically to this one, and also, these probably aren't the frames we're looking for, so we're not going to just leave it at ultra settings. Let's try turning down to the high settings. So at 4K high settings, thankfully, the 4090 is now up at 73 frames per second, but the 7900 XTX and 4080 are actually still falling short of a 60 FPS experience here, the 7900 XTX hitting 54, and the 4080 with a 6% lead at 57 frames per second. If we take a look at the 1% lows, we see the 7900 XTX at 46, the 4080 basically tied at 47, and the 4090 at 55, which is a 20% lead over the 7900 XTX. And in the averages, the 4090 was taking a 35% lead over the 7900 XTX. So again, these still might not be the settings that you're looking for, and I've noticed that Unreal Engine 5 responds very well from a performance perspective to upscaling. So what if we actually went back to the maximum ultra quality preset, but this time tried to gain performance by upscaling? Here we're using DLSS and FSR on the AMD GPU at the quality preset, which renders internally at 1440p and then tries to reconstruct a 4K-like output. And here I would say DLSS has the image quality advantage, probably hard to see through a YouTube video with compression and all that. But the fine details look a bit better here. But again, all the GPUs now are over 60 FPS, the 7900 XTX at 62, the 4080 at 70, which gives it a 13% lead, and the 4090 at 88, which is a 42% lead. 1% lows are 52, 54, and 61, respectively, so things a bit more compressed in the 1% lows. 1% lows can be affected by things like traversal stutter, which, a lot of GPUs can, I think it's more CPU related and engine related. So I think there's a little less spread there. But again, what if you wanted to use upscaling more aggressively? Here we're actually looking at upscaling at the performance mode. And where FSR at the quality setting at 4K, I thought, was competing pretty well with DLSS here. Again, not sure how much it'll come through in YouTube, but looking at the grass and things like that, the fine details, objects disoccluded, things like that, I think DLSS has a much more noticeable image quality lead here. And then from a performance perspective, the 4080 is at 88 versus 80 on the 7900 XTX, giving it a 10% lead. And the 4090 is now cracking the 100 FPS line at 104. The 1% lows, again, are a lot more compressed around that mid-60s to low 70s line, which again, I think could have to do with, engine-related traversal stutters and things like that. Anyway, if we drop down to 1440p resolution, we're at least able to play at the Ultra preset over 60 FPS on all of the GPUs. The 7900 XTX averaging 66, the 4080 averaging 70, giving it a 6% lead, and the 4090 up at 87, giving it a 32% advantage over the 7900 XTX. Looking at the 1% lows, they're once again a lot more compressed together. At 55, 54, and 62, giving the 4090 a 15% lead over the 4080, and the 7900 XTX is leading the 4080 by 1 frame per second. But again, as you turned corners, like in this area we just saw things like that, you can see the frame time graph kind of spikes a bit. I think these are like, the 1% lows are very related to Unreal Engine, just kind of traversal stuttery stuff. Dropping down to the 1440p high settings, we do get a very healthy performance boost and staying at the native resolution. And this time, we're now seeing the 7900 XTX up to 92 frames per second, the 4080 up at 96, and the 4090 at 113, giving the 4090 a 23% lead over the 7900 XTX. Things could be compressing here a bit as you can reach more system and engine and CPU-related limits to the frame rate the higher your frame rates get, which might be why we're seeing the 4090's averages compressed in a little bit at these settings. And 1% lows are all basically tied around 70 FPS at 70, 71, and 73 respectively. And as I've been mentioning, I think those 1% lows are very tied into just the Unreal Engine, traversal stuttery stuff. Anyway, looking at what if we stayed at ultra settings, but instead of using high settings to boost frame rate, what if we used DLSS and FSR on the AMD GPU at the quality preset? Here, again, I've got to say a little bit of an image quality advantage once again to DLSS. Again, not sure how much it comes through in this YouTube video. Look at YouTube videos dedicated to image quality testing for a bit more of that details, but here we're seeing 95 FPS on the 7900 XTX, 103 on the 4080, and 120 on the 4090. The 1% lows are 74, 73, and 68. So again, kind of right around that 70 FPS line seems to be as good as the 1% lows want to get. And here we're seeing the 4080 with an 8% lead in the averages, but the 7900 XTX with a 9% lead in the 1% lows. And while I don't think most people would be buying these GPUs for 1080p resolution, we will still take a look at what they could do trying to max the game out at 1080p. Because, I mean, there are definitely people who have a high refresh rate 1080p monitor for competitive gaming, but still play some single-player games, that kind of thing. Anyway, here we're seeing the 7900 XTX hitting 89 FPS, the 4080 with a 6% lead at 94, and the 4090 at 111 frames per second, giving it a 25% lead over the 7900 XTX. And the 1% lows are still all kind of compressed around that 70 FPS mark at 71, 70, and 68 respectively. Again, which one gets the small lead there, I think has more to do with just, the luck of the traversal stutter you happen to get as you round the corner. I really think that's just where this engine's at in that situation. Let's go ahead and jump to a different game. The Talos Principle 2, we're looking here at 4K Ultra. I haven't made it very far in this game, and people have said that later on the game gets even more demanding than this area I'm testing. Here, the 4090 can at least break 60 FPS. We're actually up at 68, whereas the 7900 XTX is at 52 and the 4080 is at 51. So they will not be able to hold 60 FPS at 4K Ultra. Although this time we're seeing the 7900 XTX with a small lead, whereas in Lords of the Fallen, the leads were more typically going to the 4080. In the 1% lows, we're seeing 41, 39, and 51 respectively. So here, the 4090 is able to pull ahead in the 1% lows. What if we drop down to the high preset? Still looks pretty good, still at a native 4K resolution, and now our frame rates are much more acceptable. The 7900 XTX at 72, the 4080 at 74, giving it a 3% lead. It's really basically a tie there. And the 4090 at 96, giving it a 33% lead over the 7900 XTX. 1% lows are tied for this XTX and the 4080 at 53, and the 4090 pulls ahead by 26% in the 1% lows to 67 frames per second. So it's definitely interesting here. I think things performance-wise seem a little more balanced so far in Talos Principle 2 between AMD and Nvidia. And here dropping to using upscaling, but going back to the ultra settings. So instead of turning down settings to high, what if you use DLSS or FSR at the quality preset? And we're seeing once again that using quality upscaling gains us more performance than dropping down to the high preset did. It brings the 7900 XTX up to 92, the 4080 up to 88. That gives the XTX a 5% lead over the 4080, but the 4090 is taking a 26% lead over the 4080 at 111 frames per second. If we look at the 1% lows, they're all over at or above 60 now, with the 4080 at 60 FPS, the 7900 XTX 12% ahead at 67, and the 4090 at 72, which gives it a 20% lead over the 4080. If we look at 1440p resolution and we look at the Ultra preset, All of the GPUs are around 100 FPS. We're seeing the 4080 at 94, the 7900 XTX takes a 4% lead at 98, and the 4090 is 27% ahead of the 4080 at 119 frames per second. The 1% lows are 66 for the XTX, 65 for the 4080, and the 4090 takes a 14% lead at 74 frames per second. So at 1440p resolution, it seems like you could definitely just kick to ultra settings and be happy. However, again, this might not be the most demanding scene in the game, so let's go ahead and look at what if you did want to upscale. So if we stay at ultra settings, but we use upscaling at the quality preset, DLSS on the Nvidia GPUs, FSR on the 7900 XTX, we're now getting a nice high refresh rate experience. The 4080 at 144, the XTX is 4% ahead at 150, and the 4090 is hitting 169. Nice, giving it a 17% lead over the 4080. Things probably compressing a bit there as you hit the higher frame rates. Again, you can start running into CPU streaming, engine limits, things like that kind of start to compress things a bit. The 1% low is also compressing a bit at 91, 96, and 101 for the XTX 4080 and 4090 respectively. What if we drop down to 1080p resolution? At 1080p ultra settings, all of the GPUs are performing well. Again, high refresh rate experience. We're seeing the 4080 at 133 FPS. The 7900 XTX pulls 11% ahead at 147, and the 4090 hits 157, giving it an 18% lead over the 4080. Again, things compressing a bit, I think, at the higher refresh rates as things other than the GPU can start to impose limitations. 1% lows are at 100 on the 7900 XTX and 86 and 96 on the 4080 and the 4090. Could be that as you hit CPU limits, AMD's drivers have less CPU overhead. But let's go ahead and jump into Immortals of Aveum. Starting out at 4K Ultra, we can see that this definitely, at least so far, seems to be more AMD favored performance-wise. We're seeing the 4080 at 43 FPS, and the 7900 XTX still can't break 60. It hits 52, but that does give it a 21% lead over the 4080. And the 4090 also can't hold 60 FPS at 4K Ultra in this game, hitting 57 FPS, giving it a 33% lead over the 4080, but not too far ahead of the 7900 XTX. 1% lows are 4080 at 34, and the 7900 XTX and the 4090 tied at 42, giving them both a 24% lead over the 4080. So this game certainly seems to be a bit more on the AMD-sided results compared to the previous two games we looked at. And what if we looked at DLSS and FSR at the quality preset at 4K Ultra settings? Now we're seeing the 4080 closing a bit of the gap between the XTX, but the XTX still taking a 12% lead. The 4080 is hitting 73, the XTX at 82. And the 4090 is hitting 90 FPS, giving it a 23% lead over the 4080. And in the 1% lows, we're seeing the 4080 at 57, the 7900 XTX at 69, nice, giving it a 21% lead in the 1% lows, and the 4090 at 67, coming in slightly behind the 7900 XTX in the 1% lows. But this game is the first one we're looking at that features frame generation, and not only that, it features FSR 3 frame generation as well as DLSS 3 frame generation. However, this is the earlier implementation of FSR 3 compared to the recent games like Avatar and Like a Dragon, which have better frame pacing, and I'm also not sure it's reporting the frame pacing correctly on FSR 3 to my software overlay. The frame time graph looks kind of crazy. Also, in this implementation, it would have been better to have VSync on for frame pacing, but then that caps frame rates at the monitor's refresh rate and kind of messes things up. So the point is, I'm showing you the results here that my software overlay is putting out. But again, I don't know, frame generation's a bit weird here, especially in that game. So anyway, turning frame generation back off, but using more aggressive upscaling, now at the performance mode. I think, again, it might not come across well in this particular YouTube video, but as the character moves, objects are disoccluded, things like that. I think DLSS has better image quality for sure at the performance mode upscaling. Performance-wise, The 4080 is hitting 93 FPS now, the 7900 XTX hitting 109, giving it a 17% lead, and the 4090 hitting 111 frames per second, giving it a slight lead over the XTX, but a 19% lead over the 4080. The 1% lows give an even bigger advantage to the AMD GPU at 90 versus 78 on the 4090 and only 67 on the 4080. But once again, we can turn on frame generation, and the AMD GPU does seem to be gaining the most to the average frame rates, although the 1% lows are the furthest back, at least as reported to my software overlay, which once again, not just the way things look versus what that's reporting just don't quite seem to match up to me. So anyway, throwing it out here that frame generation's something you could turn on here. Again, I really don't think it should be looked at as a performance feature, more of a motion fluidity smoothing feature. And it can work well, especially on the AMD side of things here in this implementation. I really think you have to VSync to your monitor's max refresh rate. And if you can hit that, it then does look pretty good. Anyway, what if we drop down to 1440p resolution at the Ultra preset? Well, now we're seeing the 4080 at 83 FPS, which is good, but the 7900 XTX pulls ahead by 17% at 97. And even the 4090 is only reaching 101, giving it a 22% lead over the 4080, but not all that far ahead of the 7900 XTX. The 1% lows have the 4080 at 58, with the 7900 XT at 81, and the 4090 only at 73. If the 1% lows are at all affected by CPU limitations, again, AMD does tend to have lower CPU driver overhead on their graphics drivers, so that could explain a bit of it, but this certainly just seems to be a very AMD favored title compared to the other ones we've tested. If we kick on upscaling at the quality preset at 1440p, again, image quality wise, I will give an edge to DLSS upscaling, especially again as objects are disoccluded, fast things in motion. Anyway, but the performance numbers are still giving the lead to the 7900 XTX at 134 FPS versus 115 on the 4080 and 133 on the 4090. This is another place where the 7900 XTX is basically tying and actually beating a little bit with the 4090, and a little more of an advantage even in the 1% lows again. We're seeing the 4080 at 71, the 4090 at 91, and the 7900 XTX at 107. Again, we can kick on frame generation and look at it for what it is with the numbers it's reporting. The 7900 XTX does seem to be gaining the most average frames, but the worst in the 1% lows. And again, the proper way to use it in this implementation really is to VSync lock to your monitor's refresh rate, but then I can't report on the frame rate numbers that it can deliver because the capture card I'm using at 4K is a 60 FPS capture card. So if I had tried to VSync lock it on the capture card, then it just locks to 60 FPS. Anyway, I think you guys get the issue. So again, reporting on as best as I can here. I've got a lot of videos on FSR 3 and more recent implementations that work better at variable refresh rates and things like that, if you want to take a look at those. Anyway, at 1080p ultra settings, we are seeing the 4080 able to hit 113 frames per second. The 4090 can hit 132 at giving it a 17% lead, but the 7900 XTX can get 134. So once again, seeing it slightly ahead of the 4090. And the 1% lows are 78 on the 4080, 90 on the 4090, and 107 on the 7900 XTX. So again, pulling ahead here. Again, this is a game this was one of the first two games that got an FSR 3 implementation. So I'm wondering if there's been some careful work with AMD on optimizations for this title, perhaps. Because again, the 7900 XTX beating the 4090 at times. Again, that could also be CPU limitations, advantages, things like that. But anyway, let's hop over to RoboCop Rogue City. At 4K Ultra settings, we are now seeing the 4080 pull ahead of the 7900 XTX, although by 1 frame per second, giving it a 2% lead here at 49 versus 48. So neither the 4080 nor the 7900 XTX can average over 50 FPS in this game at 4K Ultra. The 4090 can brute force its way to 67 FPS average, giving it a 40% lead over the 7900 XTX. And the 1% lows are 42, 43, and 57 respectively, advantage 4090 there. If we drop down to the high preset, we do gain some performance. The 7900 XTX and the 4080 still not quite to 60 FPS, although we're averaging 57, so on a variable refresh rate display, which I'd imagine someone buying this class of hardware would have, might as well be 60. And then the 4090 hitting 76 frames per second, giving it a 33% lead over the 7900 XTX and the 4080, which again are tied. The 7900 XTX and 4080 are both tied in the 1% lows as well at 49, and the 4090 taking a 31% lead at 64 FPS in the 1% lows. But what if instead of turning down to high settings, we wanted to use upscaling to gain performance? Looks like we do gain more performance by upscaling than we do by turning down to the high preset, as we've seen be the trend in Unreal Engine 5 titles. Here we're seeing the 7900 XTX hit 76 frames per second. The 4080 takes a 1% lead, so it's basically a tie at 77. And the 4090 pulls ahead of the XTX by 29%, hitting 98 frames per second. The 1% lows, the XTX and 4080 are once again tied at 49. And the 4090 hits 64 FPS, giving it a 31% lead in the 1% lows. But what if we wanted to use frame generation? Well, here's where the Nvidia GPUs have the advantage of DLSS 3 frame generation is just way more available. At the time of filming, only 4 games have FSR 3 frame generation, but tons of games have DLSS 3 frame generation. Although AMD did just release their open source drivers, and their Unreal Engine 5 plugin right around the time of filming this video, so hopefully more games start to support it. But this is definitely an advantage to the Nvidia GPUs if you want to smooth out the motion of your game by kicking on some frame generation. The 4080 and the 4090 can do that. Also, going down to performance mode upscaling and then kicking on frame generation, and DLSS at 4K resolution, the performance mode can look pretty good, especially if you're either on a small enough 4K screen or, as I like to do, a lot of times I'll actually play on my couch, on my TV, and performance mode upscaling from DLSS looks pretty great. Kick on frame generation, we're hitting some really high numbers here, like 128 on the 4080, 157 on the 4090, 1% lows over 100. They're compressing a bit on the 1% lows, probably hitting, engine limits, traversal stutters, things like that. But anyway, dropping back to 1440p native ultra no frame generation, we're now looking again at 1440p resolution. The 7900 XTX and the 4080 are again basically tied at 91 versus 89 FPS advantage 7900 XTX. The 4090 is at 111 frames per second, giving it a 29% advantage. In the 1% lows, we are once again seeing basically a tie at 74 and 73, but the 4890 once again taking a larger lead. What if we drop down to the high preset to try to get a higher refresh rate experience? Well, now we're seeing 99 FPS on the 4080, 104 on the 7900 XTX, giving it a 5% lead. And the 4090 takes 122 FPS, giving it a 23% lead over the 4080. 1% lows are 80 on the 4080, 83 on the 7900 XTX, and 93 on the 4090. So the XTX and 4080, again, close to tied on the 1% lows and the averages here, but a small 4 to 5% lead on for the XTX at the high preset. What if we stayed at the ultra preset at 1440p but boosted frame rates by upscaling using the quality preset? In this game, I really don't like the FSR implementation. There's a lot of crawling in the fence. There's a lot of crawling in the lighting on the street. Honestly, I actually prefer using TSR in this game to FSR. On the AMD GPU, I really don't like the FSR implementation here. But anyway, performance numbers wise, the 4080 is hitting 119. The XTX is ahead performance wise by 7%, but I don't think it's a better experience given the image quality. The 1% lows are 90 on the 4080 and 97 on both the XTX and the 4090. So we're probably hitting kind of the limits of the image. The engine can go there with traversal stutters and CPU limitations. Anyway, if we kick on DLSS quality at plus frame generation, the Nvidia GPUs can now smooth out their frame rates on high refresh rate displays. the 4080 hitting 171 FPS, and the 4090 hitting 203. Again, generated frames are not making the game more responsive, and they can introduce their own image quality artifacts. I've also noticed some stability issues in this game. When I would reload the save, sometimes when I'd have frame generation enabled, it would crash when it was loading into the save. But anyway, 1080p ultra settings. All of the GPUs here are delivering high refresh rate experiences. The 4080 hitting 120, the 7900 XTX hitting 128, giving it a 7% lead, and the 4090 hitting 141 FPS average, giving it an 18% lead over the 4080. The 1% lows are all compressed in the 90 FPS range, the 4080 hitting 91, and the 7900 XTX and the 4090 hitting 97. Again, I think things are compressing as we hit these higher refresh rates at the lower resolutions due to some of the limitation not coming from the GPUs, but from elsewhere in the system or the engine. Let's go ahead and look at Jusant. So Jusant 4K Ultra, we can average around 60 on the 4080 and 61 on the 7900 XTX, give basically a tie there, the 4090 at 79, which is 32% advantage. But I do want to mention that more demanding areas are falling well below 60. We started in a cave, for example, that was well below 60, so it can really depend on where you're at in the game, performance-wise, which is kind of reflected in the 1% lows, where we see the XTX and the 4080 at 41 and 40 FPS, respectively, with the 4090 hitting 54 FPS. If we stay at 4K resolution, but use the high preset, we now see the 4080 averaging 81 and the 7900 XTX averaging 83 and the 4090 averaging 102, giving it a 26% lead over the 4080, whereas the XTX and the 4080 are basically tied, small advantage for the XTX. In the 1% lows, we're seeing 54 on the 4080, 4% lead, so 56 FPS on the 7900 XTX, and the 4090 hitting 70 FPS even in the 1% lows, giving it a 30% advantage over the RTX 4080. But once again, what if we tested out how the engine responds to upscaling? And again, we're seeing that kicking on DLSS or FSR at the quality preset gives a much larger performance boost than reducing everything down to high does. So here we're seeing the 4080 able to average 95 FPS, the 7900 XTX getting a 107 FPS, so a 13% advantage, but again, image quality-wise, advantage 4080, so I actually think I would prefer the experience on the 4080 here, despite the slightly lower frame rate. 4090 hitting 120 frames per second, giving it a 26% lead over the 4080. 1% lows are 74 on the XTX, 61 on the 4080, and here we're moving on to using frame generation, which once again we don't have available for the 7900 XTX. So you can take a look at what the 4080 and the 4090 are able to do here at 4K Ultra DLSS quality plus frame generation. They're honestly not getting a massive boost from frame generation in this game, but it is pushing the 4080 up to 118 and the 4090 up to 152. Again, this is more, think of it more as taking advantage of your monitor's high refresh rate, kind of smoothing things out in motion on that, rather than the game actually running quicker. But still, it can definitely improve the experience of playing the game. At 1440p ultra settings, we are seeing the 4080 hitting 97 FPS, the 7900 XTX hitting 105, giving it an 8% lead over the 4080, and the 4090 hitting 122 frames per second, giving it a 26% lead over the 4080. And in the 1% lows, we're seeing the 4080 at 67, the 7900 XTX 9% ahead at 73, and the 4090 hitting 85 FPS even in the 1% lows, giving it a 27% advantage over the 4080. Now, again, we have some options like turning down to high settings to try to hit even higher refresh rate experiences. So 1440p high, we're seeing the 4080 able to hit 129 frames per second. The 7900 XTX at 148 takes a 15% lead, and the 4090 hitting 154 is not that far ahead of the 7900 XTX, but again, at the higher refresh rates, it's possible that we're starting to have the GPUs held back a bit by other engine and system limitations. We're also seeing that, I think, in the 1% lows, where the 4080 hits 88, but the 4090 hits 101 and the XTX hits 103. Could be some AMD CPU limited driver overhead advantages going on there. Which I think might be getting accentuated here as we use quality upscaling at 1440p Ultra. Image quality wise, once again, I prefer the look of DLSS in this game. And performance wise, we are seeing the XTX take a 20% lead over the 4080 at 161 versus 134 FPS. The 4090 only hitting 157, so the XTX pulling ahead here. But again, I think this can be the increased CPU driver overhead from Nvidia showing up here. That's showing in the 1% lows as to why the XTX is beating the 4090 in this situation. I think it's just the rest of the system being limited. Now, when you are CPU limited or otherwise limited by the system or the game, the engine, frame generation can push past that. Here we're seeing the 4080 hitting 188 FPS when we use DLSS quality plus frame generation, and the 4090 hitting 221 frames per second. So again, that's a way to kind of take advantage of a really high refresh rate monitor and push through other system limitations or engine limitations, which I think is one of the places where frame generation shines the most. And it really looks and runs better the higher your frame rate is. Anyway, here we'll take a look at 1080p Ultra before we go for those people using this class of GPU on a 1080p screen. Here we're seeing the 4080 hitting 128 FPS, but the 7900 XTX is able to hit 142, giving it an 11% advantage, and the 4090 is hitting 150, so it is taking the lead, albeit only 17% ahead of the 4080 and only a little bit ahead over the XTX. 1% lows are actually giving the XTX 101 versus 100 on the 4090, so slight advantage there, and the 4080 down to 88. But again, I think we're seeing more of the system or engine limitations holding back the GPUs a bit there. Now let's take a look at Remnant 2. 4K Ultra settings, we are seeing the 4080 can't quite break 60 FPS. It's averaging 52. The 7900 XTX able to average 61, giving it a 17% lead here. And the 4090 averaging 69. Nice. Extra bonus points for that, giving it a 33% lead over the 4080. Although here in the 1% lows, we're also seeing the 7900 XTX doing very well at 53 versus 45 on the 4080, giving the XTX an 18% advantage, and the 4090 taking a 36% lead over the 4080, averaging 61 in the 1% lows. If we kick on upscaling at 4K Ultra, we see DLSS FSR quality gives us a very large performance boost again, seems to be a trend in Unreal Engine. Now we're seeing the 4080 closing the gap with the 7900 XTX, but still get the XTX taking a 4 FPS or 5% lead at 88 versus 84, and the 4090 hitting 112 FPS, so 33% lead over the 4080. In the 1% lows, we're seeing the 4080 at 71, the 7900 XTX a 7% advantage at 76, and the 4090 hitting 85 in the 1% lows. Now, this is once again a game that features DLSS frame generation, but doesn't have FSR3 frame generation. So if you're on an Nvidia 40 class GPU, you can, again, try to smooth things out on a high refresh rate display by interpolating some frames. And that can get the 4080 to 105 FPS at 4K Ultra DLSS quality plus frame generation, and the 4090 at 137, which is 31% ahead of what we're able to get on the 4080. And the 1% lows also pick up to 93 and 120 respectively. So again, nice to be able to do that. And from a high enough base frame rate, which these are able to get, it looks and runs pretty good. Here, we're taking a look at 4K Ultra again, but this time more aggressive upscaling without frame generation. If we go down to performance mode upscaling, we're actually seeing the 4080 completely closing the gap with the 7900 XTX, which makes me wonder if this is kind of a memory bandwidth advantage for the 7900 XTX, whereas we lower the internal resolution, the 4080 is at less of a disadvantage there. Anyway, they're both hitting 113 FPS. The 4090 is 28% ahead at 145. Image quality wise, I would say definite advantage to DLSS again. with the disocclusion and fine details at the performance mode not looking great on the XTX. If we then kick on frame generation on top of performance mode upscaling, again, the AMD GPU does not have support for that here. We can see the 4080 boosting up to 133 and the 4090 hitting 169. Nice, giving it a 27% advantage over the 4080. I will mention that, AMD could, using its preview drivers, try to kick on like fluid motion frames. I'm using the latest full release driver here, so I'm not going to be using any of the driver level frame generation, which honestly in my testing hasn't worked as well, but I haven't tested the latest version of it. But anyway, just throwing that out there. In 1440p, we at the ultra settings, native resolution, we're back to a pretty good lead for the 7900 XTX. It's the 4080 is hitting 96 FPS, so great experience, but the 7900 XTX hitting 108 FPS, giving it a 13% lead over the 4080. The 4090 is at 124 frames per second, giving it a 29% lead over the 4080. And in the 1% lows, we're seeing the 4080 hit 79, but the 7900 XTX able to hit 90, and the 4090 able to hit 99. A lot of nines in this one. Anyway, once again, there are other ways to gain performance, like DLSS and FSR. By the way, I'm not testing high settings in this game. I've tested in other videos that the high preset is like single-digit performance gains over the ultra preset in this game, so it's really not worth running through again. There's very little difference. Anyway, if we stay at ultra settings and kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, again, as things are disoccluded, like by the character's arm swinging, things like that, FSR looks a lot more fizzly. DLSS looks a little more put together there. So image quality advantage DLSS, performance-wise, the 4080 actually pulls ahead by 2% versus the XTX. XTX hitting 135, 4080 137, and 4090 at 168. And the Nvidia GPUs can kick on frame generation and boost things further, push past CPU limitations, take advantage of smoothing things out on that high refresh rate display. And since they're already coming from a very high base frame rate, I think the image quality and responsiveness both look and feel very good. And the 4080 is at 181 frames per second with frame generation on, and the 4090 is at 219 frames per second. So if you got one of those like 240 hertz displays or something like that, frame generation can be a very good way to try to take advantage of that in a single player experience. Now, what if we take a look at 1080p before we go? 1080p, ultra settings, no upscaling or anything required on these GPUs at 1080p. 4080 is hitting 135 FPS, the 7900 XTX ahead by 5% at 142 FPS, and the 4090 is at 166 frames per second, giving it a 23% lead over the 4080. 1% lows are all compressing a bit again as we hit these high refresh rates. The 4080 108, the 7900 XTX at 118, giving it a 9% lead over the 4080, and the 4090 hitting 120 FPS, so almost tied a little bit ahead of the XTX. Again, I think we're hitting some more system limitations. Well, I thought there was a lot of interesting things to notice here. Number one, okay, so what's better in Unreal Engine 5, the 7900 XTX or the 4080? Well, the 4080 was performing better in Lords of the Fallen overall, albeit usually a less than 10%, so single-digit percentage margin generally. And sometimes a little bit more though, but the point is most of the other games were either even or small advantage to the AMD GPU. Again, I'm kind of looking right here at that 4080 versus 7900 XTX percentile difference. Some games were a standout for AMD, like Immortals of Aveum. Since AMD did implement FSR 3 in this game as one of their original launch versions, I wonder if they had some hand in optimizing the game specifically for AMD hardware in this particular game, more so in the other ones, which could perhaps explain what was going on there a little bit for that result. But then if we continue on here to look at some other games, RoboCop Rogue City, a lot more even performance between the XTX and the 4080. And generally, that was the case regardless of the settings. Sometimes, at certain settings, we would get a bit of an advantage one way or the other. Jusant, generally a bit of an AMD edge, especially it seemed as we got down to, anything that could have maybe been more system limited, that kind of a thing, where I think AMD can be less CPU limited at times, things like that, if you're hitting up against system limitations. That kind of thing due to driver overhead differences, but Jusant generally was AMD favored, and so was Remnant too. So it seems like in a lot of these games, and again, the exact settings and resolution can change it a bit, overall, it certainly seems like the 7900 XTX has the edge, other than in Lords of the Fallen. So I was curious what's different about Lords of the Fallen. So my initial thought was, does that mean that Lords of the Fallen is using the hardware ray-traced version of Lumen? So Unreal Engine 5's lighting system is called Lumen, but it has a software ray-traced version, which does not take advantage of the hardware ray tracing cores on the GPUs. But it can also have a hardware ray-traced version, which can be a little bit more accurate, which then does rely on the hardware ray tracing accelerators on the GPUs. However, that was my gut reaction to why Lords of the Fallen would be better on the 4080 versus all the other games relatively to the 7900 XTX, and also could explain perhaps why it was just overall one of the most demanding games, where the 4090, for example, would still be often below 60 frames per second at 4K Ultra. But all the research I could do online, other channels that have looked into this, everything says that Lords of the Fallen is using the software-based Lumen, so that wouldn't actually explain those advantages here, unless everything that I'm looking at about it is somehow wrong. So, that doesn't seem to be the explanation here. So it seems to be just something about Lords of the Fallen is just optimized more for the Nvidia side of things here than the AMD side of things, and it doesn't seem to be the ray tracing explaining it. And in general, out of these 6 games that I tested, none of them seem to support the hardware ray-traced version of Lumen. It sounds like my kids woke up, so you'll hear them running around upstairs here as I film. Anyway, deal with it. That's how we roll in this channel. The point is, I would like to see more of these Unreal Engine 5 games offer the hardware-accelerated ray tracing as an option. And I think if we do start to see more of that, we would start to see some more advantages flipped in the 4080 direction, or at least closing those gaps in the games where the XTX had more of an advantage. But we're certainly seeing a trend here, which is developers seem to be leaning on the software version of Lumen for now, probably because that's what works on consoles, and that's probably where their focus for game development is, so maybe they just don't want the extra quality testing of making sure the hardware version doesn't introduce any kind of issues or something like that. I don't know. But that seems to be what's going on. Just a reminder that this video was focused on Unreal Engine 5. If you go into something like other videos I've done, like 7900 XTX versus 4080 a few months ago, if you look at games like, RT Ultra and Cyberpunk using quality upscaling, you can see that the 4080 can average in the 90s even before you turn on frame generation, which could then smooth things out on a high refresh rate display up into the 140s, whereas the 7900 XTX can hit around 60 FPS-ish using quality upscaling and RT Ultra at 1440p, but then the baseline upscaler doesn't look as good, still don't have the frame gen option, although Cyberpunk is on the list of games getting a FSR 3 frame gen update, so that's at least cool. So maybe this is a good time to talk about upscalers and frame generation, because that was another big trend that we saw in the Unreal Engine 5 data. So in Unreal Engine 5, you'll notice that going from 4K, from ultra settings at native resolution down to high settings often does yield a large noticeable performance gain, but not as big as just keeping the ultra settings and kicking on DLSS or FSR upscaling. In which case, that means that if you're thinking about like what are optimized settings for playing the game, those optimized settings would often include upscaling. Yes, there can be an image quality hit to upscaling, but the massive performance gains to be had here, I think it's because a lot of what Unreal Engine 5 is doing, the big features like Lumen and Nanite, are, I think, per pixel effects. So lowering the rendering resolution, lowering those number of pixels that's all being calculated on, yields massive performance boosts. And many developers for some of the games we're testing here have specifically said their games are optimized with upscaling in mind. And I know that's kind of unpopular right now, but that does seem to be what Unreal Engine 5 is doing. So if it's really designed to be upscaled, then I think that puts, while AMD's raw performance was often ahead of the 4080, you know, depending on the game, Lords of the Fallen here is one of the less advantaged ones. But in games where it had more of an advantage, but the thing is, like, let's say something like this, where Immortals of Aveum, where, yeah, you have a big performance advantage for the XTX, but if you're gonna be kicking on upscaling to get to the frame rates that you wanna hit, I think that even if I had, 12% more frames on the XTX, but if all the frames look better on the 4080, I might be more willing to take that trade-off and take slightly fewer frames if the frames look better. And that's where I'd like to see AMD make a lot of progress. If we're going to be seeing a lot of games relying on upscaling in a lot of new engines like Unreal Engine 5, if they're designed with upscaling in mind, then we want the best looking upscaler possible for that to be acceptable. And right now, usually with DLSS, quality at 4K is just an automatic. I usually do game on a 4090 because, hey, if you've got one, of course you're going to use it. And I do play at 4K resolution a lot of the time, and even on the 4090, 4K DLSS quality I do view in almost every game I've tried it in as basically free performance. And with that in mind, 4K, FSR quality looks pretty good. That's one of its best use cases, but it still does look noticeably more grainy, a little bit more fizzly, and at the lower resolutions, those advantages are even more extreme. If we look at something like RoboCop, for example, if you were playing at 1440p and you kicked on DLSS or FSR quality, the FSR implementation in this game, I don't know how much this comes through in the YouTube video. Let me jump back here a little bit to see it a bit more. A lot of the lighting in the street here looks pretty terrible. It looks very fizzly. A lot of the details in motion. This is one of the worst implementations of FSR in the games we've tested here for sure, but it's very shimmery in the street. It's much more stable in DLSS. Actually, in this game, I went ahead and tried out Unreal Engine's own TSR, Temporal Super Resolution technology, and I thought it did a much better job than FSR did in this game. Also, look at some recent videos from like Hardware Unboxed, looking at Intel's XeSS upscaling, even the version that's compatible with AMD GPUs, and it can often produce better image quality than AMD's FSR. So if we're relying on upscaling, that's a bit of a sore spot for the AMD hardware, and I would very much like them to get a better upscaler. Because, okay, 7% more frames, but they all look worse. And a lot of times you would be kicking on the upscaler if you're on the Nvidia GPU especially, because on that side of things, it's often very much worth the massive performance gain that you're getting by kicking that on. Also, again, frame generation. AMD seems to have taken a big stride. This seems to have been their focus lately, and right around the time of filming this video, AMD has dropped their open source version of FSR3 FrameGen along with an Unreal Engine 5 plugin. And they've improved their frame generation over what we saw in Immortals of Aveum to have better VRR support, better frame pacing. So this seems to be a thing that I'd imagine will get better, which we'll start to get more parity on the frame generation side of things. So where now hopefully they focus more on that baseline upscaler. Overall, I think the only other thing I wanted to touch on is some people are like, the 7900 XTX has 24 gigabytes of VRAM, the 4080 only has 16. Well, maybe in some games that'll matter, but Unreal Engine 5 does not appear to be particularly VRAM heavy. Even doing something like kicking on frame generation, which adds VRAM usage, at 4K Ultra, DLSS quality plus frame generation, this is pretty VRAM heavy. We're only seeing about 11 gigabytes allocated and 9 reported actually used on the Nvidia GPUs in this situation. So with that in mind, 16 seems to be absolutely fine. I didn't see anything going over 11 gigabytes in any of the testing we saw here. I think one of the other heavier ones was Talos Principle at 4K Ultra, but again, 10 gigabytes. So sure, other games maybe, but if we're Unreal Engine 5 focused, it just seems to be a non-issue in this particular engine of any of the games that we've seen so far. If you're curious about the cooling differences and things like that, keep in mind my 7900 XTX in this video was the AMD reference model, which to be honest is not the strongest cooler. The 4080 was the Founders Edition, so it's kind of fair in the sense that it's what both brands sent me as review samples, and it's their first-party branded cooler. But I will say the Founders Edition coolers from Nvidia I think, tend to be better coolers than what you get off the reference model. So if you're looking at the temperature differences, realize that can vary depending on the cooler that you get. But the power draw is lower on the 4080. So if you have less watts to cool, then that does make cooling it easier. And the 40 series here does seem to have the energy efficiency advantage. It's really interesting when you get into the more of the CPU limited tests and things like that, where you'll often see the 4080 actually only drawing down under 300 watts and things like that, but still matching or beating the performance of the 7900 XTX. So it's pretty interesting if you take a look at that power efficiency rating. But anyway, I gotta go since my kids are up. Hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.